Welcome to Everyday Enlightenment. I'm your host, Patty Teal. I'm coming to you today from Sedona Mago Retreat, a spiritual retreat center on 163 amazingly gorgeous acres in Sedona, Arizona. My guest today is Ann Taves. She will be one of the leaders at the upcoming symposium on AA history at Sedona Mago Retreat, April 28th through the 30th. Ann is professor of religious studies at UCSB, where she teaches courses on religious experience, new religious movements, and comparative worldviews. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 1983 and taught for over 20 years at the Claremont School of Theology and Claremont Graduate University before moving to UCSB. She's a past president of the American Academy of Religion and current president of the International Association for the Cognitive Science of Religion. Welcome, Ann.
Hi, it's good to be here.
It's so great to have you here. This is such an interesting book that you wrote. First of all, though, before we get into all of that, I wondered, have you always been interested in various religions and spirituality?
Growing up, my family actually wasn't religious, and that may actually have sparked my interest in it because it was something that we didn't do and other people did. And I think that made me curious.
That's interesting. My background was very similar, so I really can relate to that. So tell us a little bit about the particular book that you write about, Revelatory Events.
Well, that book focuses on 3 in-depth case studies of early Mormonism, the emergence of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the emergence of the study groups associated with A Course in Miracles, which is the most recent of the 3 movements. And A Course in Miracles is a text that some might call a channeled text. I was interested in how religious experience or experiences that are unusual, that people come to view as religious or spiritual, are involved in the emergence of new spiritual paths. So that's really what the book was focusing on. To get at that question, I had to really dissect the process of emergence by looking for source materials that reflected each of these groups as they formed and the process unfolded. So there was a lot of historical reconstruction that I had to do to understand how people perceived what was going on as it happened. Then in the latter part of the book, I compared the process in the 3 groups and tried to draw some conclusions and understand more deeply how each of the 3 groups came to believe that they were being guided through that emergence process by some kind of presence or voice or spiritual entity.
Now, these revelatory events, could you synonymously call them paranormal events, or would that not be accurate?
Paranormal has certain connotations that none of the early leaders of these groups would have used those terms or been comfortable with them. Early Mormonism, they didn't really have a category of the paranormal, so it wasn't really an issue there. They would have been arguing over what was going on in different sorts of terms.
Mm-hmm.
For Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson was actually very interested in things that today we would call paranormal. Personally, he was. But he was very careful to keep that separate from the way that he talked about AA. Because in terms of developing the 12 steps and then later the 12 traditions, he and everybody involved in the process, they were trying to develop a generic kind of path that people from any religious tradition or no religious tradition could follow. So talking about his own personal interests in spiritualism, mystical experience, later in life, LSD experimentation, none of that was really publicly visible in terms of AA. With A Course in Miracles, Some of the people that were involved in the emergence of the Course were very explicitly interested in the paranormal as well. But again, that isn't how the Course would, or the voice of the Course would talk about itself. And so they tended to feel that their ideas about that were transformed by the voice that they believed dictated the Course.
Yeah, I know when you're going to be out here at Sedona Mago Retreat as one of the leaders of the Symposium on AA History, that you're going to talk about the founder's white light experience. Could you share that with our audience?
Yeah, Bill Wilson describes, well, it actually gives any number of different accounts of the experience that he had in Towns Hospital, where he was there detoxing from his alcoholism. And he had an experience there where he felt as if he were lifted up on a mountaintop and a great wind blew, and a sense of the room lighting up, and then this feeling of elevation as if to a mountaintop and feeling the wind blowing. In that experience, he had this feeling of being free from his addiction. And it turned out that he didn't drink after that.
Wow, that's amazing. Do you think that some people might consider that an out-of-body experience, or do you think that's different?
It has some of the features that are often associated with an out-of-body experience, but he didn't specifically describe himself as leaving his body. He didn't have that sort of sense, for example, that you would get in Paul's letters in the New Testament where he says explicitly, I don't know if I was in my body or out of my body, or people describe looking down on their body from outside their body. He didn't say anything like that. I may be exaggerating a little bit. I'm not quoting directly from the text. He may not have said he was lifted up to the mountaintop. That may have given a little bit more of an out-of-body sense than is in the text. He felt as if he were on a mountaintop and the wind was blowing.
Right, I understand. So, Anne, this is such a fascinating topic, and I feel very fortunate to talk to someone who has studied all these different courses and religions. I have a million questions. We will never get to them all. I noticed that you're current president of the International Association for the Cognitive Science of Religion. How does the cognitive science go together with religion?
That's a big question. If we think about cognitive science as a broad interdisciplinary field that's attempting to understand mental processes, to describe mental processes at a more psychological level, it's a little bit different from neuroscience, which is trying to describe the same kind of phenomena, but at the level of neurons or the more cellular level.
Mm-hmm.
So cognitive science is more at the psychological level, but it should ideally be able to integrate and build on the neuroscience and at the same time connect up to the social and cultural world that we're obviously a part of as people with brains and minds. So really, how it connects to religious experience is that anything that we experience in our bodies and therefore our brains and our minds. The way that our minds work is part of what shapes our experience in the world.
I asked you a huge question, didn't I? That really, you did a very good job of explaining how these different, I don't even know what to call them, these different sciences are related. So it reminded me of the field of quantum physics. And one day, do you think a lot of these experiences will be explained through a quantum physics approach?
Well, I know some people are really looking at that, and I can't say that I've dug into it too deeply. One thing that I can say, though, is that when I was just talking about the different levels and how the cognitive is a level that, in a sense, is above the neurological, quantum physics is going to be below the neurological. So we're talking about particles and forces as they interact.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding would be that as we move from one level to the other, things interact in different kinds of ways, and things can come together in more complex sorts of formations that you can't just explain in terms of something one or two or three levels below that. So I have my doubts about whether something like quantum physics is going to be able to explain the kinds of experiences we have in a way that's going to be comprehensive and satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
There may be aspects of it that kind of approach will help to illuminate, but I don't think that that's going to explain things any more than I think that neuroscience is going to be adequate to explain the complexity of our experiences.
So were many of these founders of these religions, or I guess only Mormonism of the three is considered a religion, but of the three that you studied, AA, Course in Miracles, and Mormonism, were they considered channeled, the information?
None of them would exactly embrace that term. So Helen Schucman, who was the most recent, died in the early 1980s. She was a research psychologist, very scientifically oriented, and dictated this text, which she claimed came to her from an internal voice that she identified with Jesus, at a time when channeling wasn't as much talked about as it is now. And so she would not have described herself as a channeler. But from a historian's perspective, she's definitely at the beginning of that whole kind of development, and you can see similarities between her and the people today that explicitly call themselves channelers.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Smith, the situation's also complicated because their Mormons definitely would not want to call him a channeler. But there have been some people who've tried to compare how he dictated the Book of Mormon to the channeling process. And there are definitely some interesting parallels because he did not look at what he claimed were the golden plates that he had recovered. He said that he was led by a personage that appeared to him in a vision to discover ancient golden plates that had been buried in a hillside in upstate New York. But after he allegedly recovered them, he couldn't show them to anyone. So they were always kept covered or hidden in a box. And even when he was dictating the Book of Mormon, he wasn't looking at them. They were still covered, and he was looking at a stone, a seer stone as it was called, that was buried in a hat to block out the light. So he's seeing things and dictating what he's seeing, and Helen Schucman is hearing not an external voice, but something in her mind that doesn't seem to be her, and dictating what she's hearing. So that's how they would have described it. For me, I saw common features, which is that both of them perceived a flow of words in their mind that they did not view as their own words. And they came rapidly in both cases. Helen Schucman took down the words in shorthand. Joseph Smith dictated the words to scribes who couldn't always keep up with them.
Wow, that is definitely a similarity. That's very, very fascinating. Somewhere, as I was preparing for this interview and reading about you, I read that at one point you had considered including Jane Roberts. Some people may know of the Seth books that she wrote about, and I remember the Oversoul book that I read. I think it was The Education of Oversoul 7. It was fascinating, but you decided not to include that. You can't put everything in your book, of course, but what was your reasoning for not including that one?
Well, deciding which one to leave out was a really hard decision, and I only made it after I got deep into writing the chapters and realized that to bring out the level of detail that I needed to bring out to reconstruct the process of emergence of these different groups, it was taking me a lot more chapters than I'd anticipated, and the book was just going to be way too long.
Mm-hmm.
There were several different reasons, but I think mostly it had to do with the kinds of comparisons that I thought I could set up by taking the three that I did. And Jane Roberts, because she was channeling an entity that was interacting a lot more fully both with her and with other people and writing his own books, seemed to me a complicated case that it might be better to set up different sort of comparison to bring that out fully. So it was partly the complexity of it and my feeling that I couldn't do justice to her and the Seth material in the scope of what I was trying to do.
That makes sense. And you have written many books, and hopefully there will be more to come. If our listeners are interested in finding revelatory events, how would they do so?
It's easily available on Amazon. It's available as a paperback and as an ebook, and you can also order it from the publisher, which is Princeton University Press.
And who might this book be for? What type of person, or what would their interests be or background that you think it would particularly grab their attention?
I think that people who are interested in any of the three groups that I wrote about may have an interest in the book. I've talked to a number of people from those traditions, both while I was writing the book, and now some have read it. And so I think those people are definitely interested. But in many ways, I wrote it for academics and people in general who are interested in religious experience, in new religious movements, but also in how we can understand the emergence of new religious movements in more scientific and explanatory terms. So the last third of the book is where I step back from the group's own perspectives on their emergence and talk about it from a more social, scientific, and cognitive perspective.
I am no expert, so absolutely correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that organized religions in general are not quite as popular. More people are calling themselves spiritual rather than religious. Is that actually a true fact of what's going on in our country in particular?
Yeah, I think it is. At least it's fair to say that those who self-describe as spiritual but not religious, or as there's another large group called the Nones, Nones, that sociologists are talking a lot about these days, they're growing too. Some of those folks are self-described spiritual but not religious people. So yeah, that's a growing group. It's growing particularly in the Western US, but all throughout the country. And two of the groups that I talk about would generally fall more into that category. Alcoholics Anonymous is in many ways the prototypical spiritual but not religious group, because in their 12 traditions, they explicitly state that they're spiritual and not religious, because I think they wanted to make it clear that theirs was a path that could go with any religion. They didn't want to be seen as a competitor. But today, so much of the New Age movement and various kinds of spiritual paths, people are resisting the more organizational approach and going for something more free-form and looser.
As you said, AA, they talk about a higher power, but they don't necessarily say what that higher power is. Is that correct?
Exactly. And in the case of AA, what I was looking at in particular was the way that Bill Wilson and others had a sense of there being a presence, this spiritual presence, that he was convinced of its reality because of that white light experience. But all of AA emerged around the idea of a higher power as each individual understands that. Ultimately, the structure of the group, the authority within AA, rests on the conscience of the group as led by their higher power. Again, AA is not a secular group. It's a spiritual path.
So along that line, I want to remind our listeners that you are going to be one of the speakers and leaders at an upcoming retreat in Sedona, Arizona. It's called the Symposium on AA History. And you really have to consider yourself a historian as well, don't you, Anne?
Oh, that was my primary training. I've gradually integrated more of the social, scientific, and cognitive into my work, but it's really all built on a historical foundation.
So that Symposium on AA History will take place at Sedona Mago Retreat, April 28th through the 30th, and you can learn more about it by going to sedonamagoretreat.org and then pulling up the Special Retreats Recovery Series. And then again, this one is called Symposium on AA History. Are you excited to come out here? Have you been here before?
I haven't been there before, and yes, I'm definitely excited. In fact, I was told that I could stay an extra day if I wanted to, and after I looked at the website and saw what the conference center looked like, I definitely decided to take advantage of that invitation.
Well, good for you. And I want to thank you so much for sharing this kind of complicated but very interesting topic with us. Again, I hope I get to meet you in person when you come out to Sedona Mago Retreat.
I would look forward to that too.
Okay, thank you so much for being our guest today. Bye now.
Bye-bye.